What's up, gangsters? How about yet another episode in the Spitfire adventure? I think this is going to be like 17 now. Yeah, it's a lot, but hey, it is what it is. This is how I work through one of these things. Anyhow, let's get to it. This one is going to be all about doing washes and adding some stencils. Okay, as promised, this episode is going to be about doing the washes. But before I get into that, I just wanted to note that I am working on all of the small bits to get them ready for some primer and some paint. And there are a couple of notes that I felt like were worth making right now. So let me start with these exhausts. Okay, these are the kit exhausts, and they are okay. I mean, they're typical Tamiya. They are crisply molded and they fit together well because there are three parts to each one. The tailpipe on each of the front two are separate pieces that glue on, and you've got to watch those because they're handed and they go in a particular way. And they fit really nice, but you are going to get a little bit of a joint. Now, it may not bother you, but I chose to try and smooth that off. And I guess I did an okay job, so this is kind of hard to see right there. There's a little bit of evidence of it, but I think it'll be okay. Now, the big disappointment, though, it's, I guess to be expected, is that these have not been slide molded. They've not done anything to hollow out the tips. So if you want to do that, that's on you, and I chose to give it a whirl. I'm sure that there are some resin exhausts available for this kit at this point, but I'm not going that route. But after doing some work on one of the exhausts, I would pretty much encourage anybody else to, if they care about having the tips look open, because that looks okay, but it is not an easy job. It's not too bad on that rear one because it's right there out in the open and it's fairly large, but the other two are kind of D-shaped, and that's a bit of a challenge. How did I do it? So this is my wonderful Proxxon Micro Mote. This is the 50 EF, but I think they've since released a new version that's the 60 EF. And what I use for stuff like this are my itty bitty dental burrs that my very friendly dentist gave me for $1,200. Oh wait, no, he gave me a crown for $1,200, and those were free. And they're great. And the fact that this version, the EF version of the Proxxon, means that it has this keyless 3-jaw chuck, and it means you can use any size burr. And so the one that I'm using for this, for the most part, is this kind of parallelogram shaped one, because I can kind of use the side of it to carve out that sort of D-shaped profile. But to do the round opening in the end of the other one, I used this little bitty round burr and made a dimple, and then just completed it with a drill bit. The dimple just helps you make sure you're going to get properly centered, because it's a small bit of real estate and it's a little bit of a challenge. So anyway, that's going to get those exhausts done for me. I've got the props all assembled. I'm doing an aircraft that's got a black spinner, which is nice because I can assemble all of this and it can all be painted together. So that's good. The rest of this stuff is ready. But here's the other thing that needs discussing: the antenna. If you're doing a version that has that newer antenna mast. So even if you are doing one that has that antenna mast, as opposed to the older one that looks like that, all right, you have to make a decision. Okay, this is in fact the later version of the Ariel. And when you look at the instructions, Tamiya definitely gives you the idea that these aircraft always had not only the radio antenna wire, but the cheese cutters. They are kind of nicknamed that by model makers because they kind of, look like that wire cheese cutting device. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. Anyhow, the deal with these is those the cheese cutters are IFF wires, identify friendly foe. That's a system that was incorporated probably after this aircraft was even flying, and was gone not too long after this aircraft was flying. In fact, a lot of people will tell you that these were completely gone by 1941, and that is mostly true. But, like all things Spitfire, don't bet money on it, because I've got a photograph of a Mark 9 in like 1943 that has both the cheese cutters and the radio antenna wire. Now, the radio antenna wire also went away when they switched. I think they went from VHF radio to UHF radio, and when they did that, they didn't need the wire anymore. I may have that backwards, but the bottom line is, when they switched, they didn't need it anymore. So what you will see are Spitfires that have either both of these wires, so 3 wires. You'll see them that have only the top wire. You'll see them with only these 2, although that's rare as far as I can tell. And you will definitely see a lot more of them with neither, basically no wires. So, as you can surmise, the point is that if you're going to include the upper, the radio antenna wire, you have to add this little photo etch flag looking thing to the antenna. What that is it's basically just a little bracket. I don't think there was literally a pulley in there, but that's basically what it does, is it acts as a pulley to run the cable over and down into the fuselage. And for that to happen, I chose to drill a hole right there. Tamiya gives you a little nub, but I'm not going to do that, because what I'm going to be using is the using Easy Line, and I'm going to want to be able to run it down into that hole and glue it in place. So I've got that. Now the little flag thing, you've got a super glue on there, and it fits nicely, and it's really cool that Tamiya gives you 2 of them. It's one of those neat little favors they do you, because they know that you might lose that part, and they were right. I did. I lost the first one. But when you do glue it on there, you got to be careful not to fill it up with super glue, because you're gonna need to be able to run your cable down through that through the middle of it. So just be careful with that. At any rate, that gets all of these bits ready for some primer, and now let's get on to actually doing some washes. Okay, so as promised, finally down to doing some washes. But, you knew there was a but, right? Even though I've got this thing all set up on my Masterpiece Models aircraft jig. This is a thing that I designed in conjunction with John Geigel at Masterpiece Models. It's a pretty cool gizmo, and it's great for this activity. Anyway, had to do that little plug there. John's a good guy, and I don't mind doing that at all. He has a lot of neat stuff on his website. But I just wanted to call out one thing that's been added, and that is these red patches on all the machine gun ports. So what's up with that? Well, as I'm sure you know, if you're building this kit, those patches are included with the decals. And those are easy to use, and they're not wrong. But if I used those, then mine would look exactly like everybody else's who has used those decals. And the fact is that these patches were far from uniform. They did make rolls of sticky cloth that had standard-sized patches on them, but they were also done more by hand, if you will, on many occasions. And what they did in that case is they used the kind of RAF standard linen cloth with red dope to create those. And so that's what I wanted to do, kind of, looking at some of my reference photos, and the effect I like. I purposely piled the paint up pretty thick so that it would kind of show a little bit of an edge. And my intent is that when I come back and do oil work, that I'll work on those a little bit and make them look a little bit, like hand painted or whatever, if you will, because that's how a lot of them looked. Now, somebody said, wait a minute, weren't the gun ports supposed to be covered? And the answer is, well, yeah, but after a mission, they obviously, if the guns were fired, those were blown out. But you can see photos of some where they are actually perfectly round like that. And I don't know if that means that they had stripped it off and it just left the patch, left it kind of looking like a patch, or if they decided not to use them and they just carved the excess out from inside the holes, or what. I don't know. But the bottom line is I've got some reference photos that show that. So that's the look I'm going with. Anyhow, all right, now let me get rearranged here, and we'll get back to the washes thing. Okay, so what I'm starting out with is the black panel line stuff. I'll be using 3 different colors on this, but I start with the black, and pretty much always do that, and this is what I use. I love this stuff. It's easy to use right out of the bottle. It's a great consistency. It flows really well. It has really fine pigmentation, and it's really dense. So it's perfect for what I like to call functional panel lines. And that's anything that moves or is removable to be opened or whatever. So things like the access to the gun bays, ailerons, little round hatches like that, the cowling where it's removed, cockpit door, just anything like that. And I like the way that looks, and it kind of helps tell the story that those are all operating surfaces. So I've already done all of the stuff on the top side, and it's time to flip this thing over and work on the other side. So we can kind of see this process in action. And washes are pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but this is about my particular way of doing it, which you may or may not agree with. Anyhow, I find that this stuff works best if I put it in a little shallow container like this. The pigments have a tendency to settle out pretty quickly, and you've constantly got to be shaking it or stirring it, and so this makes that real easy to do. I like this Lowe and Cornell Ultra Round number 2 for this, because for me this is very much a pin washing operation where I'm trying to be precise. I'm not doing what some people call a sludge wash, where they just smear it all over everything and then clean up the excess. I'm definitely trying to get it only where I want it and not have to clean up a bunch of excess, because cleaning it up is work, and I'm lazy. And you also find when you go to cleaning this stuff up that you can run into issues of maybe it affects your paint, or it creates stains or whatever. I mean, bottom line is, the best way to deal with the cleanup is to just not have to do it, right? So, there's going to be some excess. That's just part of the process. But as you can see, I'm trying to keep that minimized. And I don't mind if I get some staining around all these little, fasteners and the edges of these panels and things, because I'm going to be doing some oil work there to indicate greasy hands anyway. So if I get a little bit of staining, not a problem. You can see I've applied a lot more, and I've also introduced another color, which is this dark brown. And it's one of my favorites because it's great for areas where panel lines need to show up as kind of dirty and grimy. And if you know Spitfires, you know that whole underside, or the center of the underside, is going to be filthy and streaky. So I'm just preparing for that, and then stuff that's around the wheel wells and or behind the wheel wells and so forth. So I have lots. I think I've pretty much got all of it that I want to apply right now, and it's time to get into cleaning up the excess. So there's a couple of tricks there. The number one thing is when you're using Q-tips, use really good ones that are really tightly wound. If you use the loose, fluffy ones, you're going to be frustrated because they kind of act like sponges, and they tend to pull the wash out of the places that you're trying to keep it in, and that's just you end up just chasing your tail. But before I get on to that, let me mention one more thing. You'll notice that this stuff has kind of dried and thickened up in here. This is very much a Goldilocks exercise when you're applying these washes. You can see that in some places where it's gone down, it's super dense. In other places, it's less dense. That's just kind of the nature of the thing, and that's what I meant about keeping it stirred up. And sometimes you have to just kind of tweak the process on the fly, especially like when you're trying to touch up or add a little bit more to a certain area. Like take that panel line right there around that access bay, right up there by the door that's real gross. It's not quite uniform there on the bottom side, so I'm going to add a little bit more. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little tiny brush, and I'm going to put some mineral spirits in it and dip it in the wash, and try and get it to where it's the exact consistency to flow. If it just immediately makes a blob like that, it's a little bit too thick. So what you might do is dip your brush back in the mineral spirits and immediately come back and do it again, and you'll see maybe that it'll start to flow a little bit better. If it is super thick like that, not a big deal. It just means that it takes a little bit longer for it to dry so you can do the cleanup. Point being is that it's very much tuning it on the fly to get the exact right consistency that you need so that it will not only flow properly, but also have the right amount of pigment in it. Like that just doesn't want to flow right there. So I'm going to take that off. Add a little bit more mineral spirits to the brush. Do it again. See, it immediately starts to flow better. So again, it's just trial and error. All right, now, I keep saying I'm going to talk about the cleanup. I promise. I know sometimes I go around in circles, but it is what it is. Anyway, the basic thing with cleanup is use a really good, tightly wound cotton bud and just get the barest whiff of mineral spirits on it. What I do is I dip just the tip of it in the mineral spirits, and then I wick most of it out onto a little rag, and sometimes I'll even do 2 or 3 of these and just let them sit and let some of that mineral spirits evaporate out, because you really just barely need any. And if you have too much, if it's too wet, again, you'll find yourself just washing the wash out of where it needs to stay. And then it's just, you just have to be quick. You shouldn't have to do a lot of scrubbing. If you're working on a truly matte surface, you will have to do a bit more scrubbing and you will get a bit more staining. But if that's what you want, then that's okay. But that's the basic thing. And I always try and work across the panel line, because if you work with the panel line, again, you're going to just be scrubbing it right out, scrubbing the wash right back out. And you notice that I did a thing with my finger. Your finger is one of your best little tools for this. I guess the skin on our fingertips is just absorbent enough to remove some of that mineral spirits, but obviously your fingertip is not going to be able to conform to the panel line, and so it's great at just kind of rubbing right across the top of things. And it doesn't really matter that much, because I really want to get all of it off and not have any staining, but I also try to do it in the direction of the airflow, just in case there are some streaks. They make sense. So, that's just the tedious part of the job, is just, going back and working around and getting all that cleanup done. But you got to do it. Now, as you can see, there are going to be places where you will get the wrong color in the wrong panel line, okay? And you can see an example of that right here. See where it's flowed into this part of the panel line right here in front of the aileron. Okay, I don't want that. I'm gonna make that a different color, because that's not part of the functional panel line that gets removed. So what I do is I just take a brush, really small one that's got some mineral spirits in it, and I just come back and just clean it out. And you should be able to get it pretty well cleaned out. It doesn't have to be 100%. It just needs to not be black. And, using a small brush lets you control that. Now, this same brush is also really good for doing that last little bit of cleanup that your Q-tips or your fingertips are not getting. And so you can just very precisely kind of go and work around these sections that need to be taken care of a little bit better. And you can be really precise that way, and obviously you can take up a whole lot of time. And I'm sure that some of you guys are watching this, you're thinking, man, this is ridiculous. I really do not want to put this much time into doing a stinking panel line wash. And you don't have to. You can do the sludge thing where you just dump it all over the entire surface and wipe off the excess, and that's fine. That's not wrong, but it's going to produce a different look. And this thing of using different colors is just something that I always do, even though it does take a lot of time, because I feel like it adds that last sort of little bit of realism and authenticity and storytelling, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, it does. It takes time. The other thing you can do sometimes with cleanup, same thing with your little brush. If you've got an area where you need to just remove a little bit very carefully off of an area, take the brush that's got that whiff of mineral spirits in it and just rub it sideways across the panel line. But you can see I took off a little bit too much, or I didn't have enough in there to begin with to go all the way around that little hatch or whatever it is. So no big deal. I'll just work it a little bit make it a little bit more uniform, and when I like it, then it'll be good. Anyway, like I said, this is all just very much an iterative process. Another thing that's important is whenever you do some cleanup with your brush, you really have to go back and clean it a lot. You can see that I'm pulling some mineral spirits out of those bristles, because if you don't do that, you're basically just carrying the same pigments around with you and smearing them someplace else. And again, that just becomes a tail chasing exercise. So anyhow, I think those are all of the kind of tips that I can give you on doing all of that basic application and cleanup of the washes. And now I've got my work cut out for me, so I'm going to finish this up and we'll come back and take a look at it. Okay, so I think I am about done. Pending, of course, a final inspection where I'm sure I will find things I don't like. But this is what the bottom of this thing looks like now after all of the washes have been applied and cleaned up and tuned up and touched up. And I think I'm good with it for now anyway. So it's going to be time to flip it over. And yep, just like I thought, there's a spot that I missed when I was doing my last bit of cleanup. Sure, that won't beat the last one I notice. Anyway, now it's time to flip it back over and go back to work on the top side and start dealing with doing some washes in the greens and the browns. I've already done a little bit in the green on one side over here to see how it would look. And when I come back to it, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Alright, so it's the next morning, and exactly as I predicted, I came in here and looked at this thing and found some things that I wanted to tinker with. Just a couple of little spots that I missed. But the main thing was this conundrum over here. Now, generally, my tactic, strategy, whatever you want to call it, on panel lining and riveting is that I want to do a darker version of the base color. I don't want it to be just really over the top, so I don't use black on everything. That it's not just that it interferes with, you know, trying to tell the story of operational surfaces like these, but to me it's just visually harsh. And it's a little bit of a challenge on this thing because basically all that Tamiya gives you, as wonderful as their panel lines are, is these operational ones. Like there is no, you know, just general riveting or panel lining done on this thing. You know, you got a little bit of it over here, but really pretty much everything in here is a door of some kind. And so it's a little bit difficult to differentiate, especially on white, you know, where the difference between black and dark brown is pretty subtle. I mean, it's there, and I don't really know if it's going to if it shows up on this camera shot or not. It's one of those things that's maybe too subtle for for the average digital sensor. But what definitely is a conundrum is things like these, you know, dark blue sections of the roundels and this whole black thing, because how do you do a darker version of the base color? Well, you can do dark blue, obviously, but it's going to be really dark, and at that point, black is just as good. So that's what I did there. The same thing applies on this black stuff, and I'm putting black in air quotes because this is not pure black. This has got a little bit of white in it. It's more like an 80, probably 90% gray, and probably I could have made it even a tiny bit lighter, but the Tamiya panel line wash is definitely a super hard black. And so it occurred to me, you know, why not go ahead and run that in there and see if it makes a difference? Because I want some contrast, and it's not going to make sense to go with a lighter version of the base color. That's just not going to jive in your brain with everything else that's going on. It might work if we were trying to depict that all of these panel lines were filled with dirt, like you might have on a Pacific Island Corsair, for example. So anyway, I did that. I ran the black stuff in there, and it definitely does make a difference. It's subtle, and I'm not sure you guys are going to be able to see it on camera, but it is definitely enough of a difference that I feel like it was a good move. So that's that, and it is now definitely time to flip this thing over and work on the top. Immediately, I'm into the thing I was talking about, which is trying to work my panel lines and rivets in the color of the, in that darker version of the base color. So with camouflage scheme, that becomes honestly a pain in the ass, because you've got panel lines like right here, here. Come on. You've got panel lines like right here that start and stop in different colors. So how do you keep the color of the panel line separate? Well, like I showed you before, honestly, some of it is just about cleaning it out where you don't want it. And then some of it is just, luck and maybe taking advantage of the subtleties of the product. And that's one of the reasons why I use this stuff right here on these greens. All right, this is the MIG green-brown panel line wash. Now these MIG washes are pretty cool because they come in a bunch of different colors, but the thing about them that's definitely different is that whatever the varnish that's in them, okay, because these washes are essentially just tinted clear enamel varnishes, and whatever they use in these makes it where it's a lot less stuck than the Tamiya panel line washes, if that makes sense. And so what that ends up meaning is that it's pretty convenient because you can do your removal dry. And that's really, that's nice. It's easy because, yeah, it's simpler, but it also means that the stuff stays in a good panel line better. And I mentioned a second ago that Tamiya panel lines are great, and they really are, because when you think about the cross-section of a panel line, it's just a channel. It's a ditch. And as skinny as these panel lines are, they have a very nice rectangular cross-section. It's relatively deep compared to its width. And that's fantastic because it holds these washes a lot better. If you've ever tried to do a panel line wash in one that is kind of got a rounded bottom and it's relatively wide, you know how hard it is to make the stuff stay in there and have really nice density. So these are great, and it definitely helps with all panel line washes, but especially with this ammo stuff that you can remove dry. Because look right here, okay? I've obviously just applied it a few minutes ago to that panel line, and all I have to do to remove those excess droplets is just rub it off of there with this dry Q-tip, which I can do very lightly, and it does a good job of staying inside the panel line. And you can see it's subtle, but that is a darker green than the base green. Now, it's also bled over there into that white stripe there, and I don't want that, so I'll come back and I'll wash that out of there before I put the color in there that I want. But that's the basic thing that's going to happen now with all of these areas of green. Now, I should point out, Tamiya does not make a green. Or I'd probably be using it, honestly. But I could also be doing this with oils. This is a case where it would be relatively simple to create my own panel line washes using any of several brands of oils that are available. But it's just more trouble. And honestly, when you're lazy like me and you've got a relatively small amount of panel lining to do, as is the case on these green sections, yeah, I'm gonna take the quick route. So there you go. That's the green parts. Okay, I've worked all these remaining upper surface panel lines, and I think I'm about done. But there is one touch up that I left because I wanted to show you guys what I was talking about before, where you get overlapping colors. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see it. Look at that panel line right there. Okay, it's pretty subtle, but I think you can tell. You can see where the brown over on the right hand side flowed into the green, and it went over the green that I had already put down there. And yeah, subtle, but definitely noticeable. You can hear one of my cats in the background. She's clearly disapproves. Anyway, yeah, so I got to fix that because that'll definitely show up in photographs, and not a big deal. Okay, so I'm gonna use the green stuff again, but I wanted to show this to you because it's been sitting out here, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not as big a fan of this ammo panel line wash. Look at the difference in the way that it settles out in the dish compared to the Tamiya stuff. Look at how much more finely pigmented the Tamiya stuff is, and the way that it settles out, how much denser and just like better. And this stuff just kind of falls apart. And you can kind of see that when you're flowing it into your panel lines too. This is also something that I notice with oils, okay? If you use the Winton student grade oils, you'll see more of this effect. They tend to fall apart because they have more filler in them and less pigment. But if you spend a little bit more money on your, greens and browns and things that you need for panel lines, then and get the artist's grade Winsor and Newton, then you'll see more like this. I haven't made any washes using the ep282 502 stuff, so I don't know how it behaves. But there you go. That's an important difference. All right, so the washes are all done. And now it's time to move on to the final stage of this thing before locking it all in with some clear and getting on to some weathering. And that is stencils. And you can see that I have added some right here on the wing. And if you're looking closely, you will notice that there's a complete absence of carrier film. Look at how wonderful that is. So, how did that happen? This is the thing that I mentioned before about something coming in the mail to address the stencils. And what that is HGW wet stencils. And so I'm going to show you those, and this is going to be a short tutorial on how to use them, but this is what you get. Okay, now these things, and this is what they look like on the sheet. All this is a set of stencils, no other markings. Now, yes, Mark 9, but as you know, if you know Spitfires, most of these stencils stayed consistent throughout the history of the Spitfire, if they were there at all, which on early Spitfires is certainly a valid question. Now, here's the thing. These are not decals. I don't know how many times I can say that. It's just something that bears repeating over and over again. These are not regular decals. Did I mention these are not regular decals? So, in fact, the only thing that they really have in common with decals is that you use water to remove them from the carrier. And I'll show you that here in a second. But when you look at the instructions, okay, soak in hot water. Water doesn't have to be hot. Okay, now they call it a decal, which is silly. And this is an older version of their instructions. Their newer ones are a little bit better. Okay, apply as regular decal. No, not really. Don't do that either. Push the water from below the deifine, let it dry for 3 to 4 hours. Yes, you need to do that. Remove the transfer foil and clean the glue stains with water. Okay, that's your only real clue right there that this is in fact a completely different operation. So, Let me show you how this works. What I've got here is this little stencil, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to just deposit it in some water. And this is just plain water. This is not my normal decal water that's also got micro set in it for as a wetting agent, because you don't really need it here. I mean, I guess it wouldn't hurt, but it's not really required. Now, it doesn't take very long for this thing to start to come loose from the paper. And one thing that you would not have been able to see from the camera view is that even though I've cut a fairly large chunk of it out of the sheet, I've scored on either side. You can probably see that there. I've scored on either side of the actual stencil, so that I end up removing a smaller piece of carrier. You don't really have to do that, and you'll see why here in a second. But it's just, I don't know, kind of an OCD thing for me, because then I've got nothing more than is necessary. Now, this has already come loose from the film. And the next thing that I'm going to do, and this is where things get definitely different from a regular decal, I'm going to use a little bit of micro sol. And I like micro sol for this because it's strong enough to do the job and not strong enough in most cases to screw with your paint. So, because normally, I do not recommend applying a setting solution directly to the model prior to adding the decal, but it's essential with this process. You have to do it. All right, now we have to work fairly quickly here, and you have to be careful, because even though micro sol is a pretty mild setting solution, it's still strong enough to mess with your paint if you've got like chipping fluid underneath it, or something like that going on. So you have to be careful. Don't do a lot of scrubbing around. Okay, so you can see I've deposited the thing there, and it's in pretty close to the right position. Now, the good news is that the film on these is strong enough that a little bit of setting solution like micro sol is not going to soften it up a lot, but it's good to keep it wet until you know that you've got it in exactly the right spot. And I'm going to have to probably get off camera here for a second so that I can get a good look at this and make sure that it is in fact straight. So let me do that. And when you do have to move them around, a wet Q-tip is not a bad option, but they are a little bit finicky. And you can see that even with that wet Q-tip right there, I created a little bit of a scratch in the paint. Just rubbed a little bit of paint right off of there because of that micro sol, sorry. Anyway, that is now straight. Okay. And what you do then is you need to get a Q-tip with just some water on it. And all you're doing now is just pressing on it. Stick it in place. Don't twist. Don't do anything to make it want to move, which happens far too easily. So all I'm doing is just really mashing it down there, making sure there's not any water left underneath it, and that it is firmly stuck to the thing. Okay, and that's good. That's it. That's all you do for now. All right. Now, you do need to wait a while. Don't get impatient because you will pay the price. In my experience, 6 hours is a good number. I certainly would not go less than that. So, what we have to do now is, well, now, let's fast forward to 6 hours from now. And just like a cooking show, I have some queued up over here on this side that are ready for the next step. And you can see that the transfer paper is, or film, whatever you want to call it, is still there. And so now we do the next step, which is to peel the transfer paper off. Okay, and what you want for that is you need something that's kind of sharp, but that has a little bit of an edge to it, but that obviously is not going to scratch your paint. So a Q-tip or not a Q-tip, a toothpick that's shaved down to a thin edge is perfect for this. Okay, because all I want to do is get under the corner of the film, and it's a little bit hard to see, but just get under the corner of the film. That's all you need, is just lift it. Just like that. All right, hopefully you can see there what I've done. I've lifted the film just enough. Okay, and now I'm going to get my very sharp tweezers, and I'm going to grab that part that I lifted up and slowly and carefully peel that back. And you can see, I'll show you here in a second. All right, so this is the danger, and this is why you have to use a little bit of setting solution when you put them down, especially on super smooth paint. See how I lost the last 3 letters there? That's what will happen, is those letters will come back up with the film if you haven't done this properly. It's also good, I forgot to mention, before you do that last step, maybe like, I don't know, like just a little while after the thing dries, like give it an hour or so, is burnish it with a Q-tip to give yourself, extra advantage. Now, I mean, because obviously if you want perfect stencils, that one is ruined, and in this set they don't give you any extras. But for me, I don't have to care because of what I'm going to do next. All right, as you can imagine, I'm sure. But let me go ahead and peel this other one. And I try to peel it just like I do tape, where I pull it back on itself. That helps. And of course, the one where they give you twice as many as you need comes off fine, and the one that you don't get any extra, yeah, anyway, that's just Murphy's Law, right, of things. Anyway, there you go. You can see that it is all good. But you can still see a little rectangle of something there, okay? That is the glue that they mentioned in the instructions. And so what you want to do is just get a Q-tip with a little bit of water on it. Doesn't have to be soaking, just enough. And then you just come back and scrub on it a little bit. Doesn't take a lot of pressure, doesn't take a lot of effort. And basically that adhesive from the film will come right off. But again, when you're working with water, if you've got chipping fluid in play there, again, just be careful. So there it is. That's how you do HGW wet transfers, and they are lovely. There is just nothing that compares when it comes to, getting something that looks like it's been painted on. Now, The reason that I don't care that I lost a couple of letters on these walkway forward stencils is because, of course, I am going to wear them off a little bit anyway, because that's what happens in that area. Maybe worn completely off. So, super, super fine sponge, all right? These things are very fragile when it comes to this step. So, you really need to sneak up on it. If the first trick doesn't work, and I'm a little surprised that this sponge is not getting it done, then you can always go to a slightly more aggressive thing. I've got a piece of 1000 grit right here on this in my tweezers. Let me see how that does. Yeah, that's working better. And this is nice. You can do this with decals too, but it works really well with these. You just have to be super careful, because they will come right off of there, and it's it's an effect that you don't want to overdo, especially when you don't have an extra. But that's the end result right there. A very authentic looking worn stencil. Oh, now speaking of stencils, and I mentioned that it was a valid question as to whether or not they were even there. You'll find in photographs that you could come to, either conclusion. On the bottom of this thing, definitely not any, because that was all overpainted at the squadron level, and I think the consensus is that they probably didn't have the time or the desire to repaint all those stencils. But in general, and especially with early World War II Spitfires, there is quite a bit of variability in markings, and this just gets proven over and over again. So I mentioned that these roundels on the fuselage were overly large. So I found out by chance why that is. Okay, so I told you I scanned from the color call-out sheet these that they have on there, and I said, they're probably too large. Well, nope, they're not. Okay, so it turns out that DWK was a really interesting and unusual aircraft. For whatever reason, when they put the roundels on here, they just added that yellow band, and they made it extra wide. So instead of being the standard size roundel, it ended up being overly large, and you can see it on some of the 610 squadron aircraft, and others not. There's a mixture. That's something to be aware of. Like in the instructions here, they show you the same picture for number 19 squadron. May or may not have been true. Photographs show that it definitely was true for 610. So, yeah, I kind of goofed there. But because this entire thing is a might have been set of markings and the belly colors and all of that, I think it's totally plausible to say, well, all right, fine. This was an aircraft that got transferred from 610 Squadron over to 54 Squadron, and that when they did that, they not only changed the squadron codes and left the roundels, but they also repainted the serial number after they added the tail band, in like December of 1940 or whatever it was, because the 610 guys had painted out all their serial numbers for whatever reason. So, anyway, I think it's still plausible, and I'm okay with it, and that's it, and it has to be okay, because there's no way that I'm going to go back and erase all that and redo them. We are way too far down the road for that. All right, so that's that. Getting much closer to the next stage of this thing, which is going to be putting an ungloss on the whole deal and doing some exhaust staining, some powder burns, some breech snot, some oil paint rendering basically, and that's going to be a lot of fun. That's the part that I look forward to the most from the very beginning. This whole thing is essentially just a process of creating a weathering canvas for me. So we'll get on to that. But a couple of notes about the markings. So I've made no bones about what this thing is from the very beginning. This is, for me, a kind of an amalgamation of reference photos that I have of what I think is a fun representation of an aircraft as it could have been in about the spring of 1941. And I like doing these. I like doing these more than just taking a color scheme or a set of markings that we're a lot more certain about, because we have great reference photos and because there's decal sets available and all of that. Because for me, this forces me to actually go and do more research and do more learning, because it's not being spoon-fed to me. And so I find myself digging around on the internet and not just looking for photos, but reading a lot of stuff and learning things and reading between the lines that enable me to create an idea in my mind of what could have been rather than what absolutely is. Now, I'm certain that 54 Squadron used the code KL, and that they probably used, an alphabetic progression. So I don't necessarily know that KLF was an actual aircraft in 54 Squadron, but high probability. But then there's that serial number. Yeah, I totally screwed up on that. And somebody pointed this out to me in Scale Modelers Critique Group within seconds, because that's what we do in Scale Modelers Critique Group. I should have looked beyond just the Spitfire serial number database to determine whether or not there was any Spitfires with that serial number. Because as it turns out, in 3727, yeah, definitely not a Spitfire serial number, but it is a Sterling serial number. So, yes, I have a Sterling bomber serial number on my little could have been Spitfire, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. Whatever. I wish I'd done a better job of that, but never occurred to me that I should look at other aircraft types, and that probably should have been obvious, but I probably, if I had even thought of that, would have said, yeah, is that really worth the time? Because they probably used a different part of the alphabet for other aircraft. So I don't know. Anyway, that is what it is. But let's talk about the colors on the on the belly a little bit, because I've been getting some shit about that from a couple of people. One particular conehead in general has gone to great lengths to prove that I'm wrong, and that this just could never have happened. And it may not have ever happened, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it could have happened. And I'm pretty agnostic about these things, and what that means is basically that I recognize that there are things we know for certain. We know that Spitfires had 2 wings, a Merlin engine, and 1 pilot. Those are absolute, undeniable, verifiable facts. Then there are things that we don't know, but that we can know. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly how many Mark 1s were built, but that's a matter of historical record. I can know it. It's totally verifiable. Then there are the things that we know that we cannot know, or that we understand that we cannot know. And that's, to me, where the real fun starts, because that's what enables us to get into places where we can create a might have been example. And here's I think the perfect way to kind of illustrate that. So let's take DWK as an example. All right, now DWK is illustrated in this color call out as having a sky colored belly. Now, there are people who will swear that this is impossible. And here's the reason why. Okay, we know for certain that the RAF Air Ministry issued orders in about mid-August for all Spitfires to have the bellies painted in Sky Type S. We also, unfortunately, know for certain that DWK, actually the first of 3 DWKs, well, I didn't even realize this until just recently. This is one of those bits of knowledge that I learned from digging deeper. The Mark 1 DWK was the first one, but it crash landed on 24th of August 1940. So less than 2 weeks after the orders for Sky Type S were issued, it was on the ground and written off charge. Fortunately, the pilot walked away. But later on, 610 Squadron had 2 more aircraft. They were Mark 5Bs that were designated DWK. But anyway, that's not the important part. The important part is that there are no historical photographs in color of DWK. There are only some pretty grainy black and whites. There's nobody around who was there on the day the aircraft was painted to tell us exactly what color it was. There are people who swear it was sky blue, the lighter blue color that was in use at that time as well. But the bottom line is, there's no way to know. There's absolutely no way to know. So anybody who swears that they're certain of what the color of that aircraft was on the bottom just makes themselves look like a clown, because there's simply no way to know that. And the same thing is true of this color scheme. Okay, we know for a fact that the Air Ministry issued orders in June of 1940 to paint one wing black, one wing white, and have no roundels. We know that for a fact. We know that sometime in August they started spraying the bottom of these colors bottom of these planes in Sky Type S. What we don't know is exactly what color Sky Type S was. It wasn't even really well defined until about a year later. And so the fact that MRP calls that color sky is not necessarily wrong, even though a lot of people will say it's more of a gray color. We also know for a fact that in about December of 1940, they issued orders to paint one wing black again, put a roundel on it with a yellow band around it. We know that for a fact. They did not issue the order for this wing to be white, but I just kind of liked it. I thought it looked pretty good. And hey, maybe that wing was still white from before. Maybe they never repainted the entire belly of this thing. Who knows? Bottom line is that people being people, taking shortcuts, being lazy, paint supplies being what they are, orders not necessarily being followed immediately. We don't know. There is no way to know. So, is this a likely color scheme for the belly of a Spitfire in spring of 1941? Nah, probably not. But that does not mean that it was impossible. And I'm totally cool with that. And you should be totally cool with it as well. And I hope that people will keep this in mind when they are doing their own projects and think a little harder about maybe going off the color call-out sheet, doing a little bit more research, actually learning more, and doing things that are a little bit more interesting than what everybody else is doing. So anyway, that's enough of that waffling. Time to get out of here and move on to the next stage of this project. But as always, if you've stayed tuned in, much love. I appreciate you watching.